Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the scenic and beautiful Trinity Alps, just north of Redding, California. The mountains here are some of the most rugged and remote peaks in the United States. From the bottom of the valley, the climb rises 1 vertical mile, over 2 miles hiked. That's a 50% grade and makes for some very steep climbing, but the view is breathtaking, in more ways than one. The granite peaks loom over the valleys, packed with black locust, poplar, cottonwood, aspen, maple, and birch trees. The bushes are almost as diverse as the trees, with elder, rhododendron, willow and dogwood casting the low canopy of the forest. Along the forest floor, Columbia black-tailed deer and a few elk keep the plants trimmed, while coyotes, cougars, and bobcats keep the prey animals in check. Other denizens include foxes, skunks, raccoons, river otters, and a curious little part-time predator called the ringtail. On Saturday, August 15, 2020, USDA Forest Service employee Ken DeCamp headed up the East Fork Lake Trail to photograph wildflowers. He enjoyed the solitude of this location. Given its ruggedness, few people came to the area. He knew he would essentially have the mountain all to himself and relished that thought. Ken huffed and puffed his way for a few miles up the trail, pausing to take in views as he caught his breath and taking a few nice photos here and there. At about 10:30 a.m., he crossed the creek just before the East Fork Lake Trail met the lake's shore. He paused in thirst. It was 97 degrees already, and the hike had taken a bit of the spring out of his step. The clear, cool creek danced tantalizingly in the sunlight of the warm day, and beckoned him to quench himself with its refreshing taste. Ken looked around and saw a nice clear spot beneath a willow bush, so he walked over and slipped his backpack straps off his shoulders to near his elbows and swung its weight to the ground, just above the steep decline to the creek bank. He bent over and carefully placed his camera down as well and clambered down the slope to the water for a sip from the creek. He drank the cool water until he felt satiated, then plunged his canteen beneath its surface to fill it for the return trip. As the bubbles from the opening of the canteen ceased, Ken knew he was ready to get back to his task. Ken slowly stood up and put the lid to his canteen back on. As he turned around, he glanced up, and a few short feet up the steep incline from him stood a small and apparently very surprised black bear. As Ken's eyes opened wide in surprise, the young black bear lashed out in a blur with its right paw. Ken tried to duck, but the speed of the swat caught him flush on the forehead just above his left eye socket and sent him spinning through the air back into the creek bed below. The man fell face first on the rocky shore of the creek bed, knocked unconscious and limp, with his head about half submerged in its cool waters. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Ken returned to consciousness and watched as his blood tainted the clear waters of the creek. His head hurt and he couldn't see as well out of his left eye. He slowly struggled to his feet, recalling that he was on blood thinners. He stumbled over to his backpack and retrieved a handkerchief to staunch the bleeding from his forehead. His pharmaceutically altered blood quickly drenched the handkerchief and ran down over his face, dripping onto his clothes and the earth beneath him. Ken's head was spinning from the impact of the bear's swat. He was dizzy now, on top of being dehydrated from the day's heat. His vision was blurry, and he could feel his eyelid had been torn up pretty bad by the bear's claws as it struck his head. As Ken searched for the final pieces of the puzzle of what was the last few minutes, he could see the bear's tracks pressed into the forest soil. He could see where the bear stopped for a second when it swatted him, and then clearly stepped right over his unconscious body as he lay next to the creek. Fortunately for him, the bear was not hungry enough to eat a sweaty man that hot day. Ken clumsily repacked his backpack and picked up his camera before following the bear's tracks back down the trail. Ken knew he had to get back to his truck parked at Buck's Ranch about 2 miles to the north. As he slogged the steep trail, the heat of the day intensified, increasing the misery of his condition. He began to feel nauseous, and his head pounded with pain, both of which are symptoms of a concussion. He started puking and forced down big sips from his canteen, which immediately came back up. He vomited until he could only dry heave. Ken knew he couldn't follow the steep and winding trail safely, so he opted to head straight down the ridge in the direction of his truck. The sweat from his head rolled down into the gashes on his forehead, stinging his wound as the blood continued to trickle from it. For 6 hours he battled the heat and the rugged terrain, but finally emerged on the road, where he rested for about a half an hour. His truck was only a half-mile up the road, but Ken had to pause every 25 yards or so to let his pounding head settle a bit. That last half-mile took a grueling hour to stumble up the hill on the road to where his truck was parked. Ken knew he had to get to the hospital as soon as he could. He drove for another 2 hours, all the way to Redding and the waiting arms of the emergency room medical staff there. As Ken walked the short distance from the parking lot into the entrance, he collapsed one last time, exhausted, confused, and near giving up. The staff at the ER cleaned up the wound on his forehead and eyelid, as well as closed it up with a few stitches, then administered pain medicine to dull his aching head. 5 months after the run-in with the small black bear, Ken was mostly recovered. He had to do eye exercises to rehabilitate his vision, as well as wear scleral contacts to help him regain his depth perception damaged during the attack. Ken is quoted as saying, "It all boils down to something my dad told me many years ago. You do what you have to do, no matter what the situation, because you always have to come home." Given that his injuries were nowhere near some of the episodes on this channel, I would say Ken got off pretty lucky. He was lucky the bear wasn't hungry. He was lucky the bear wasn't just a little larger and more powerful. He was lucky the bear wasn't a sow, protecting her little cubs. Ken finished his comments with this: "An experience like this won't keep me from returning to my backcountry adventures, in the Trinity Alps or anywhere else. Life is too short, and there is too much to experience to ever be fearful of something like this happening again. If there's a lesson to be learned, it's this: always be aware of your surroundings and never take your safety for granted." Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.